Hello, reading room. I am so excited. We have a new look for our reading room, which is the cover of the book. You know, excluding the name, since we have the name over here. I'm so excited. A Dangerous Idea by Debbie Levy. Oh, do I have that name? I think I have Deborah there. So I'll change that. A New York Times bestseller. Let's get to it. I've got the inside description there. And we're going to get started. Chapter number 1, The Drugstore Plan. It was a warm afternoon in early May, perfect for a friendly game of tennis. John Thomas Scopes was battling the fuzzy ball back and forth with some of his students on the clay courts at the high school. He just finished his first year as a teacher and was hardly much older than the kids he taught. Another boy, a little boy, not one of the tennis players, approached the court. He waited for a point to end. Mr. Robinson says, "If it's convenient," the boy said to John, for you to come down to the drugstore. Frank Earl Robinson, Doc Robinson, some called him, owned a drugstore, but he was more than a shopkeeper. He was also chairman of the Ray County School Board, Rhea County School Board. John was curious, but he didn't hurry off the court. When the game was over, he walked downtown in his sweaty shirt to Robinson's drugstore on Main Street to see what was up. Doc Robinson gave John a chair. The boy who worked behind the fountain brought John a soda, and what was up was a gathering of the leading citizens of the tiny burg of Dayton, Tennessee. "John, we've been arguing," said one of them. That was George W. Rapelier, who worked for the company that owned the nearby failing iron and coal mines. He was young, 31, originally from New York. "I said that nobody could teach biology without teaching evolution," George continued. "That's right," John responded. He could not imagine where this conversation was headed. George went to the shelf where Doc Robinson displayed for sale the textbooks used in the local schools. He picked one up, a civil biology. "You have been teaching them this book?" It was the standard biology textbook in public high schools across Tennessee, and high schools across the country for that matter. The book included a brief section on evolution, the scientific theory that animals, plants, and people have developed over time from earlier species. Although neither biology nor evolution were his fields, John had been hired to teach physics and math, and especially to coach football. He had been filling in for the regular biology teacher who'd been out sick all semester. "Yes," John said, he used a civic biology in class. How else was he supposed to know what to teach? Okay, so here is inside Robinson's drugstore, Dayton, Tennessee, where town leaders hatched the plan for the prosecution of John Scopes. Now remember, that's who they're at the wherever place with, right? So yeah, Mr. Robinson says if it's convenient, the boy said to John, for you to come down to the drugstore. I kind of read that wrong. So it's John Scopes who's at the drugstore, and so he's part of it, and they're going to prosecute him. All right. Title page of a civic biology, the textbook authored by the state of Tennessee for use in high school and used by John Scopes in his biology class in Rhea Central High School. Right there. So that was the book he used. How else was he supposed to teach biology? Now Doc Robinson joined the conversation. Then you've been violating the law, he said. Everyone around the table, 2 lawyers, the school superintendent, Robinson, and Rappelia agreed. John had broken the law. Now would have been a good time for someone to slap John on the back and tell him this was a joke. After all, teaching from a civic biology hadn't been his choice. He'd been following the statewide curriculum, trying to do whatever the regular biology teacher, who was also the principal, would have done. Anyway, since when was teaching a unit in biology class a crime? Since 7 weeks earlier. On March 21st, 1925, the governor of Tennessee signed into law House Bill 185, more commonly known as the Butler Act, after John Washington Butler, the state legislator who introduced it. In the words of the Butler Act, educators in Tennessee's public schools were barred from teaching any theory that denies the story of the divine creation of man as taught in the Bible. The law went on to prohibit any instruction that man has descended from a lower order of animals. In other words, no evolution. The amount of time that John had spent on evolution with his students, well, he couldn't remember, but it was hardly any. The men around the table didn't care. Whatever it was enough. John had broken the law. But this was, in fact, a far friendlier conversation than it might seem. Before the men had summoned John, they'd been discussing something that George Rappelia had seen in the Chattanooga Daily Times. The American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, a group formed a few years earlier with the mission of protecting individual rights, wanted to bring a legal challenge against the Butler Act. But the organization couldn't do that until a teacher was charged with breaking the new law. Distinguished counsel have volunteered their services. The ACLU announced in a press release that was printed in the newspaper, "All we need now is a willing client." So there's the newspaper. Plan assault on state law on evolution. So it was a planned assault on the law. So using our judicial system to, regulate a teacher and what they're doing, and none of your, whatever. It's when there's harm going on in other places, this is what you want to do. This is paving the road for eugenics and science is what it's doing. The headline in the Chattanooga Daily Times on May 4th, 1925, that got George Rappelia's attention. George Rappelia could not stand the new anti-evolution law. He had some scientific training and was offended by the law's implication that a person could not believe in God and acknowledge evolution at the same time. Of course you could. Yes, evolution was a scientific explanation for how all living things, including humans, could trace their lineages back over eons. Evolution described how life changed over those ages from simple to complex forms. And yes, the scientific explanation appended the biblical story of a literal 6-day creation told in the book of Genesis. But George and many people of faith agreed that the theory of evolution was perfectly consistent with religious belief. Perhaps the supreme being's greatest creation was the evolutionary method of metamorphosis by which species were always changing. Perhaps the Bible's 6 days of creation meant something other than 6 days of 24 hours each. Perhaps they were days of extraordinary length, each lasting millions of years. Perhaps the creation story was a literary device. But if some people thought that evolution wasn't consistent with religion, well, the theory of evolution was science, and schools should be in the business of teaching science on their science classes, not religion. Unlike George, Doc Robinson and the other town leaders didn't detest the Butler Act. Walter White, the school superintendent, for one, And Walter White, by the way, is the name of the teacher in Breaking Bad. Walter White, the school superintendent for one, thought the law was a fine idea and the theory of evolution a godless notion that would corrupt America's youth. But George knew how to get them interested. Mr. Robinson, he'd said before the group sent for John, you are always looking for something that will get Dayton a little publicity. True, Dayton's bigwigs wanted to put their town on the map. Its coal miners, blast furnaces, and button factories had closed. There just wasn't much going on in this eastern Tennessee borough, and that was not good for townspeople who wanted steady jobs. It was not good for small businesses that needed townspeople with money to spend. People had tried all sorts of things, a factory to make crates in which to pack the strawberry crop that fruited every spring, a hosiery mill, a cotton ginning company, but Dayton remained in the doldrums. I wonder if you have seen the morning paper, George continued. Robinson had seen the newspaper, had seen the ACLU's plea, but hadn't seen what it had to do with Dayton. George shared his brainstorm. Dayton should accept the ACLU's offer to challenge the Butler Act. They should enlist the biology teacher at Dayton's own Rhea Central High School. Surely he taught evolution. The city attorney should prosecute the teacher under the Butler Act. A trial would be held in the local court. The ACLU would come to defend the teacher. The town would make sure that no harm came to the accused teacher. His job would not be endangered, and he would not incur any legal expenses. The eyes of the nation, maybe the world, would be drawn to the case, which meant they would be drawn to Dayton. Hundreds of people, especially newspaper reporters, would come to town for the trial. These people would need to eat, drink, and sleep. This would all be a windfall for the local restaurants and hotels. Even more importantly, the event would show off Dayton's many fine qualities: hard-working people, paved streets, nearby railroad connections, beautiful land, freshwater springs, the scenic mountains nearby, Chickamauga Lake, excellent fishing, and countless cool swimming holes, not to mention the meandering Tennessee River. All these fine qualities might attract some important new industry to set up shop in the faltering town. So when John T. Scopes sat down with his soda, the first thing George and others needed to know was whether he taught evolution. In Chattanooga, for example, an hour's drive to the southwest, the school superintendent told a reporter that teachers in schools there didn't teach evolution. The head of the schools in Knoxville, the city 80 miles to the northeast of Dayton, dismissed the idea of teaching evolution, explaining, our teachers have a hard enough time teaching the children how to distinguish between plant and animal life. But John said he had taught evolution, sort of, maybe. He might have. He did use the textbook with its explanation of evolution. The men happily told him he'd broken the law. And next, Dr. Robinson asked him the question that could create a circus in Dayton and a frenzy beyond. It would create a history as well as legends. It would create history as well as legends. It would highlight rifts between city and country people, modernists and traditionalists, religious adherents and non-believers. It would entice two of the most famous personalities in the country to come to Dayton to settle scores in a battle that had been years in the making. John, would you be willing to stand for a test case? John was known to be mild-mannered, mild-looking too, lanky with straw-colored thin hair and horn-rimmed glasses that gave him a scholarly appearance. He was quiet, but he wasn't a pushover. Still, he didn't need to think too long about Robinson's question. There's a picture of John Scopes here to the left and George Rapelye who came up with the idea of prosecuting John to bring attention to Dayton, Tennessee. So that was their plan. Not caring much about what you're teaching or religion or evolution, and then what they ended up really unleashing in that fight. He was quiet, but he wasn't a pushover. I already said that. Still, he didn't need to think too long about Robinson's question. Yes, he answered. Yes, he would challenge the anti-evolution law. So a justice of the peace came to the drugstore and issued a warrant for John's arrest. A constable arrested him. Frank Robinson picked up the telephone and called the Chattanooga newspaper. "This is E.E. Robinson in Dayton," he said. "I'm chairman of the school board here. We've just arrested a man for teaching evolution." George Rapelye sent a telegram to the American Civil Liberties Union in New York informing them that Dayton had the willing client they were looking for, and John, after draining his soda, returned to the tennis court for another game. Chapter 2, The Real Target. The pages of George William Hunter's book, A Civil Biology, that were dedicated to the science of evolution numbered no more than 6. No more than 6 pages dedicated to teaching evolution in that book that they're taking to trial, right? In a volume of 400 plus pages. But although a civic biology was the source of John's supposed wrongdoing, the target of the Butler Act was a different book and a different author. 2 different books, really, both written by an English naturalist named Charles Darwin. The first was titled On the Origin of Species. It grew out of a 5-year life-altering ocean journey the naturalist took nearly a century before the drugstore clique gathered in Dayton. Darwin was hired in 1831 by the captain of a little ship called the HMS Beagle. The captain's main task was to survey and map the coast of South America, taking a westward route across both Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Darwin's job as a naturalist and geologist was to investigate and take detailed notes on the landforms and life encountered on the globe circling voyage. When he set out on this exciting and dangerous journey, Darwin didn't imagine himself writing a book that would jolt the world, but that is what he ended up doing. Once back home in England in 1836, Darwin began working through his data, thousands of pages of notes, and a vast collection of animal and plant species, all pointing to the amazing diversity of life. He had detailed notes on the size and structure of birds, on beaks and claws, on fossils of giant armadillos and llamas and rhinoceros-sized rodents. There were lists of specimens, zoological diaries, and geological journals. He conducted experiments in his garden and backyard dovecotes. He consulted with fellow scientists. From 1836 to 1858, more than 20 years, Darwin compared and contrasted, considered and recommended. Slowly, he was becoming convinced that mountains of evidence pointed to one conclusion: life on Earth had evolved over millions of years. Borrowing a term from the work of animal breeders, he called the process of this evolution natural selection. Natural selection, 2 words to capture many. Relentless random mutations in offspring lead to small transformations of traits. Some of those traits, and here is Charles Darwin around 1854, a time when he was working on his book on the origin of species. Some of those traits end up being better suited to constantly changing environments compared to animals that lack those traits. The offspring with the mutated traits are more likely to survive and have offspring of their own. I'm not quite sure, what he's, smoking over there, but mutations consistently, historically, lead to a lesser form rather than a greater form. All right? Even with the viruses, right? A variant is lesser viral than the earlier strain. See? See, senor? That's why it's really important for us to learn. The idea didn't occur to Darwin in one sudden burst. In 1844, midway through his 20-year process, Darwin wrote to his friend and fellow British scientist, Joseph Hooker, "I am almost convinced, quite contrary to the opinion I started with, that species are not... It is like confessing a murder immutable." It is like confessing a murder. The idea of some type of evolution was already circulating among scientists, but the long-held views in science as well as religion was that all species were created long ago by God, as described in the Bible's book of Genesis. These God-created species were immutable, that is, unchanging. Darwin was finding, however, that species were in fact changeable. Modern species had mutated from earlier species. They had in fact changed. This was to many a darkly subversive view, and Darwin even had to convince himself that everything had been taught to believe, that he'd been taught to believe about the history of life on Earth had been missing the very nature of change and the changing of nature. And that's what I said, thank goodness we can learn. That is the changing of nature, folks, even if it is physiological. Before this, he had clung so closely to the book called Natural Theology by William Paley, an English churchman, that he could recite its lines by heart. Lines like, "The marks of design are too strong to be got over. Design must have had a designer. That designer must have been a person. That person is God." But now he had to follow the evidence. A few years before he made the confession to his friend Joseph Hooker, Darwin published an account of his journey on the Beagle. In it, he noted, for example, that finches from the different islands he visited in the Galapagos were similar in many ways, but their beaks were markedly different in shape. The various beaks were well suited for eating the particular seeds and other foods available on the different islands where the finches made their homes. Seeing this graduation and diversity of structure of beaks in one small, intimately related group of birds, Darwin wrote, "One might really fancy that one species had been taken and modified for different ends." And that again is the beauty of creation, isn't it? In my mind. So it says there is Geospiza, all right, so they're the different species there. 1, 2, 3, and 4, we'll call them. Instead of me butchering the names, I'll put it up close so you can see them if you know how to read those names. Drawings of beaks of finches from Charles Darwin's book, Journal of Researchers, also known as The Voyage of the Beagle, originally published in 1839. I think just give me one sec. Okay, it takes me a minute because my knee is really bothering me. But I'm getting my books that are right here that I've had for a while. And we did Aesop's Fable from one of them, and here is the other one that I've had for a long while. These are Harvard classics. My sister wouldn't give me the money. I didn't have the money for all of these, and there were a couple other things. I think encyclopedias said I was buying, or something like that. I don't remember. But this was the one that I got from, and it's really interesting that, well, whatever. The name Lynn keeps coming up in all the books that I got. My other one was from Lynn Anderson. These are from David H. Lynn. What's up? And here it is. Charles Darwin's Origin of Species, but from the Harvard Classics. That there Darwin study at Down, Kent, from an etching by Axel Haig. But in here, I know. Here are some of the sketches. Now, clearly that's not the original. But here he's getting his Tree of Life idea. And, you know, that's just gotten such a bad rap. Really, it has. Because the Tree of Life comes from a single source. So it just gets a really bad rap. I could have swore. Nope, I don't have that. The picture is not in here. What a waste of time! Shh, moving on. Might the birds' beaks have transformed over time? Might these birds have shared ancestors that started in one location and then dispersed to separate islands where their beaks over countless years changed in ways that reflected their particular environments? I don't think the changing of the beaks took countless years. I think that you're interpreting evolution as being over thousands of years because that's what it would take to change a major characteristic. I don't think so. But okay. The very questions challenged the long-held view central to the faith of so many people that God had created all animals, species once and forever. Besides Hooker and other British friends, Darwin reached out repeatedly to Asa Gray, a professor at Harvard University and the most prominent botanist in the United States. The two engaged in a flurry of correspondence. My dear sir, Darwin began in April 1855, I want to beg a great favor of you, for which I well know I can offer no apology. I have the greatest curiosity about the alpine flora of the United States. He knew he was directing his question to a man who would find them irresistible. Whatever there was to know about plants in 1855, Gray probably knew it. I rejoice in furnishing facts to others to work up in their bearing on general questions. He responded. The two naturalists sent blizzards of enthusiastic missives across the Atlantic. In considering the beaks of the finches, Darwin had pondering, striking differences among birds that otherwise seemed closely related. Now he was trying to tease out an explanation for his observations of similarities among plants that grew in far-flung locales. They were different species but shared characteristics that suggested they had descended from the same ancient ancestors, which eventually led to the big question. Faced with these strong similarities, was it reasonable to continue to assume that every single variety of plant was specifically independently created by God? Or was it reasonable to conclude that these varieties had common ancestors? And this is the whole thing about heresy. Oh my gosh, what is changing? What that shouldn't change? God's word, and you with your heresy. God's word's not changing. Your laws regarding heresy keep changing. And it's despicable. Okay. Although Darwin hadn't admitted it outright, he wasn't only trying to explain flowers and trees. He was trying to work out the puzzle of life itself. And that's what we're supposed to be pondering, you dingbats. That's what we stopped pondering when we decided that capitalism was our God. Finally, in a letter dated July 20th, 1857, the British naturalist spilled the beans to his Harvard friend. But as an honest man, I must tell you that I have come to the heterodox conclusion that there are no such things as independently created species, that species are only strongly defined varieties. I know that this will make you despise me. Remember, there are strongly defined varieties, and that's what science actually does support. Darwin knew that Asa Gray, a man of science, was also a man of God. In the textbook that he published that very same year, First Lessons in Botany, which became the leading school book on the topic, Gray instructed students that the Creator established a definite number of species in the beginning, which have continued by propagation, each after its kind. But Gray did not despise Darwin, and his response to his friend revealed the open mind of a scientist. No one can have worked at systematic botany as long as I have without having many misgivings about the definiteness of species. Later in 1857, in his next letter to Gray, Darwin outlined his bombshell theory of natural selection. It contradicted what his friend had so recently written in his textbooks. It contradicted so much of the thinking that scientists and non-scientists alike had accepted for so many centuries. There was not, according to Darwin, a definite number of species formed once and for all time at the beginning. Each creature was not distinct and unchanging over the ages. Rather, species were changing all the time. By now, Darwin was working diligently on what he called his big book, a book that would reveal his findings and theory to the public. He wanted to make it as perfect and convincing as possible. By the summer of 1858, he'd written about 250,000 words. He figured he needed another 250,000 to complete it. 500,000 words, that would be a long book. A very, very long book, more like a multi-volume set. And he'd already been at work for 2 decades. Just at this time, Darwin received a letter from a fellow British naturalist, Alfred Russel Wallace. Wallace had also been investigating natural selection, and in his letter he shared his conclusion about evolution. They were remarkably similar to Darwin's. The two men immediately wrote a scientific paper together. Wallace's emergence as a fellow evolutionist provided the spark that Darwin needed to release his theory into the larger world. Publish your book already, his other friend urged him. It's been 20 years, and if you don't, someone else will beat you to it. So finally, Darwin decided to unleash his ideas on the public. Rather than the gargantuan big book he'd been planning, he would publish what he considered only an abstract of the larger work. Maybe so, but it was still 502 pages. On the Origin of Species was published in England on November 24th, 1859. To much excitement and controversy, Wallace didn't publish a book of his own on the theory of evolution, but in Origin of Species, Darwin prominently stated that Mr. Wallace, who is now studying the natural history of the Malay archipelago, has arrived at almost exactly the same general conclusions as I have. Immediately, Darwin sent a copy to Asa Gray. It arrived by Christmas. In the margins, Gray wrote such notations as "well put" and "yes" and exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point. Yes to evolution, or transmutation of species, or descent with modification, as the scientists put it. Yes to natural selection, and yes still to God. Gray saw evolution itself as the work of God and revised his high school botany textbook to include both Darwin's theory and a supreme being, all living things, and the workings of natural selection. Gray wrote, are the conception of one mind. Darwin sent early copies of his book out widely, including to another luminary on Harvard's faculty, Louis Agassiz. Agassiz was the most famous zoologist in the United States. He was also a racist through and through, believing in the superiority of white people over black people and other people of color. He took white supremacy to an even more odious level when he decided and taught that black and white people did not belong to the same species. So it was not surprising that when Harvard professor scribbled in the margin of his copy on the Origin of Species, it was to complain. This is truly monstrous. The mistake of Darwin, a sentence likely to mislead. This was, after all, a man who was scientifically certain that God had not only separately created every species, but had also specifically created the species of white people superior to and different from the species of black people. Are you hearing what the genesis is of the argument against Origin of Species? It is for white supremacy. An argument against Origin of Species is an argument for white supremacy. That is the foundation of this theory. The foundation of, or the historic foundation of Darwin's theory. While Harvard professors such as Asa Gray and Louis Agassiz debated the merits of Origin of Species, ordinary people in the United States had a few other things on their minds in 1860, like the bitter debate over slavery, like the divisive presidential election, which elevated Abraham Lincoln to the White House, which led to the dissolution of the nation and civil war. Still, when an American publisher made Darwin's book available to the bookstore and libraries in January of that year, intellectuals, academics, religious leaders, and the just plain curious dug in. Many embraced the book. To anti-slavery advocates, Darwin's theory uncovered the noxious nonsense behind the notion that black people and white people belong to different species. Do you hear that? Darwin's theory uncovered the noxious nonsense behind the notion that black people and white people belong to different species. The theory of evolution said that all people had common ancestors. It was not a stretch to say that, therefore, all were equal. Over the next decade, debate around Darwin's ideas. So his theory is evidence for all were equal. Do you see how perverted that theory ended up becoming? Over the next decade, debate around Darwin's ideas bubbled and frothed in the pages of magazines and journals, in drawing rooms, in auditoriums and lecture halls. Unlike Agassiz, many, if not most, scientists came to accept evolution. However, there were serious differences among them in how exactly they thought species evolved. Was it through Darwin's natural selection, that is, through the slow accumulation of random modifications? Did species evolve through changes that were not random, but rather that came about in response to some need of the organism? Did the giraffe have a long neck because its ancestors were reaching high in trees for food? Did species change through a supernatural mechanism, that is, through the work of God? Darwin himself did not pretend to know how exactly traits were passed down from one generation to another. He was only certain that they were passed down somehow. And what about human beings? Origin of Species contains not a single word about the evolution of humans. This was an intellectual omission. As Darwin explained in a letter to Alfred Russel Wallace in 1857, I think I shall avoid the whole subject as so surrounded with prejudices, though I fully admit that it is the highest and most interesting problem of the naturalist. But Darwin could not leave that highest and most interesting problem alone. Our ancestor, he wrote in a letter to Scottish geologist Charles Lyell, was an animal which breathed water, had a swim bladder, a great swimming tail, an imperfect skull, and undoubtedly was an hermaphrodite. Here is a pleasant genealogy for mankind. That didn't disturb Darwin, but he feared many of his fellow human beings would be appalled. He couldn't help himself, though. In 1871, he published his theory for all to see. His follow-up book, The Descent of Man, set out the evidence that human beings, like every other species, descended from earlier forms of living creatures. The origins of mammals, including primates, were sea creatures. People, Homo sapiens, were a type of primate. We too could count sea creatures in our family tree, and our prehistoric ancestors were related to other primates like gorillas and chimpanzees. Man, Darwin wrote, still bears in his bodily frame the indelible stamp of his lowly origin. The skeletons of mammals, including humans, were similar to birds, amphibians, and reptiles. When Darwin compared the embryos of various species, he was even more convinced of his conclusions. At various stages in their development, human embryos appear nearly identical to the embryos of other vertebrates. Okay, so here are some pictures now. And so here, the very first one, there's Darwin. Darwin's book, The Descent of Man, piqued public interest and also became fodder for numerous editorial cartoons. Clockwise from below right are images from 1882 issue of Punch, an 1887 issue of Punch, and an 1871 issue of the Hornet magazine. We read an excerpt with a cartoon from Punch magazine today in our Bookless classroom, which was part of our Gilded years. So it's interesting, that really hard satire from Punch magazine. That punch from Punch, right? Okay, so there's Darwin's Descent of Man. There's Darwin and is on the body of an ape. Darwinian ancestor. Guess what I need? Uh-oh, haven't had it in a while. Haven't needed it in a while. Touche, that's what she said. Comparing the song for "Oh, It Is Such a Norable Tale." Our ancestor was an animal which breathed water, had a swim bladder, a great swimming tail, and an imperfect skull. Darwin to Lyell. So there is the ancestor right there. I read that caption there. And then the last caption I'll read right here. Oh, no caption there. Well, it does say, man is but a worm. That's what it says. Yeah, so you can kind of take a look at some of those pictures. Okay. Darwin also identified parts of human anatomy that no longer serve any purpose. Rudiments, he called them, such as a particular point on the outer ear, as leftovers from earlier stages of human evolution. People were appalled, as Darwin anticipated, but they were also fascinated. In the United States, hundreds of publications spread the news. As one popular journal noted, soon after the book was published, its sales were almost unprecedented in scientific literature. Editors at Harper's News monthly magazine predicted, there is no doubt it will exercise a very powerful influence upon the science of the day. The most widely read American women's magazine anticipated that the descent of man will call forth discussion and dissent among the masterminds of the age. Two of those masterminds were still children. Okay, so we read chapter 1 and chapter 2 of A Dangerous Idea. I don't know if you saw chapter 2, A Real Target. We're going to be reading chapter 3 and chapter 4, so Clarence and Will. Those are the two infants at the time, or children. All right, so this is Dr. Annette Feravich. I have to get one of my handy dandy magnet bookmarks so that I can see that we are on chapter 3 of this book, and it is called A Dangerous Idea, Day 1. I will get our playlist out there sometime as soon as I can. Hopefully today, hopefully right away, actually, but I don't know. Depends on whether or not I feel like going out shopping. I have a little bit of shopping to do. I'm almost out of milk. Always gets me out of the house. I want to see also here, I'm just going to take for a minute, and we're going to take a look at the chapters here. All right, so there are 25 chapters, so we're going to split that in half then, and we are going to have 12 and a half chapters, so 12 days it'll take us, 13 days it'll take us to get through our book, A Dangerous Idea. The Scopes Trial, the original fight over science in schools by Debbie Levy, a bestseller in the New York Times, or New York Times best-selling author. It's also a Bloomsbury book, which is really good for young people. Dr. Annette Feravich, thanks for joining me here in the classroom, where we are in the reading room on day 216 of the classroom. It is July 8th. Thanks for joining me for day 1 of our book, A Dangerous Mind.